Man went to nursing home to make donation and found his mother who had been missing for 35 years. Michael Coleman adjusted his navy blue tie while his assistant checked the lighting for the corporate photos. The equipment donation to Spring Haven, a modest nursing home on the outskirts of Chicago, was just another marketing strategy for his construction company, something his public relations department insisted was essential for the company's image. That was when his eyes landed on that familiar profile by the window. An elderly woman with white hair tied in an impeccable bun, gazing at the garden with that particular way of tilting her head. Michael's heart skipped a beat. It was impossible, yet undeniable. That woman had the same face as his mother, who had disappeared 35 years ago. "Shall we begin, Mr. Coleman?" the photographer asked, adjusting his camera. Michael didn't answer. His feet were already carrying him automatically toward the woman. Something inside him, an inexplicable certainty, pushed him forward. Each step seemed to lift the weight of decades of unanswered questions. "Excuse me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Could you tell me your name?" The elderly woman turned slowly. Her eyes, a blue faded by time, met Michael's. For a moment he saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze, but it quickly faded, replaced by a polite, distant expression. "My name? I'm Elizabeth. Elizabeth Parker. At least that's what they call me here," she replied with a gentle smile. Elizabeth Parker, not Elizabeth Coleman, but his mother's maiden name was Parker. A coincidence. Michael felt his legs weaken. "Do you have any children?" he asked, struggling to keep his composure. The woman seemed momentarily confused. Her time-worn fingers touched the edge of the window, as if seeking support. "Children?" she repeated, her gaze distant. "Sometimes I dream of a little boy. He has eyes like yours. But Dr. Sarah says they're just dreams." Michael's assistant approached, concerned about the delay in the photo session. "Mr. Coleman, we have a schedule to keep and—" "Cancel everything," Michael cut in, never taking his eyes off the woman. "Tell them I'm not feeling well. Reschedule for another day." The assistant hesitated, but Michael's tone left no room for argument. With a nod, he stepped away to relay the necessary instructions to the team. "Have you been here long?" Michael asked, sitting in the chair beside Elizabeth. "Long." She smiled, the same smile he remembered. "Time is strange for me now. Sometimes it feels like I arrived yesterday, other times like I've always been here." A staff member approached, watching the scene with curiosity. "I see you've met Mrs. Elizabeth," she remarked with a smile. "She's one of our longest-term residents. She's been with us nearly 15 years. 15 years? Michael's chest tightened. "And before that?" The staff member shrugged. "You'd have to check with administration. I know she was brought in by a relative, a sister or cousin, I think, but that person rarely visits." Michael tried to contain the flood of emotions, overwhelming him. 15 years in this nursing home. And where had his mother been in the 20 years before she disappeared, if it was really her? Even after hours of talking with Elizabeth, Michael had no definitive confirmation. The woman's memory was fragmented, with moments of clarity mixed with confusion. But every gesture, every tone of her voice, every detail of that woman screamed to Michael, "She's your mother." As he left the nursing home, he promised Elizabeth he'd return the next day. She smiled, showing no expectation. How many promises of return had been made and broken over the course of her lonely life in that place? Driving his imported car back home, Michael felt a mix of emotions he hadn't experienced in decades. Long suppressed memories flashed through his mind. His mother combing his hair before school, humming softly while cooking, crying silently when she thought no one was watching. When he arrived at his mansion in Highland Park, Michael ignored his wife's questions about the cancelled photo shoot. He locked himself in his office and picked up the phone. "Robert, I need you to look into something for me," he said to his trusted lawyer. "Discreetly, it's personal." The next morning, Michael woke before his alarm after a restless night. He dressed simply, avoiding the suit and tie he'd normally wear. He wanted to seem more approachable, less intimidating for Elizabeth. His wife, Jennifer, intercepted him on his way out. "Michael, you've been acting strange since yesterday. You have that meeting with the city officials today, did you forget? Cancel it, he replied, grabbing his car keys. Tell them I'm unwell. Jennifer frowned, concerned. In 22 years of marriage, she'd never seen her husband cancel an important meeting without good reason. Is there something going on that I should know about? Michael hesitated at the door. How could he explain something he didn't fully understand himself? I think I found my mother, he finally said, his voice shaky. Jennifer paled. Her mother-in-law was a subject rarely mentioned in their home, a ghost whose absence had deeply shaped the man she'd married. What do you mean? Where? At the nursing home, the one from yesterday's photo shoot. I'm not sure yet, but I need to find out. Without waiting for a response, Michael left, leaving Jennifer frozen in the entryway, 1,000 unanswered questions swirling in her mind. At Spring Haven, Michael found Elizabeth in the same spot as the day before, by the window. This time, he'd brought an old photo album, dug out from the back of a closet in his home office. "Good morning, Mrs. Elizabeth," he greeted, trying to steady his nerves. "Do you remember me? I was here yesterday." She looked at him, and for a moment, she seemed confused. Then, a smile of recognition lit up her face. "The young man with the sad eyes," she said. "You came back." That simple yet precise observation struck Michael deeply. His mother had always said he had old soul eyes, even as a child. "I brought some photos to show you," he said, sitting beside her. "Would you like to see them?" Elizabeth nodded, curious. Michael opened the album to the first page, where a picture of his mother holding him as a newborn lay. "This woman. She looks like you," he remarked, watching her reaction closely. Elizabeth studied the photograph for a long time, gently tracing it with her fingertips. For a moment, her gaze seemed lost in some distant place. Then she smiled. "She's beautiful, and she has a beautiful baby too." "You don't recognize her?" Elizabeth handed back the photo with a vague expression. "Sometimes things get jumbled up in here," she said, tapping her temple, "like scattered puzzle pieces. I know they should form a picture, but I can't put them together." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Michael spent the entire morning showing Elizabeth photos, searching for any concrete sign of recognition. Occasionally, she'd make comments that gave him hope, only to slip back into the fog of her fragmented memory. "This beach house," she said, pointing to a photo of Michael, around 6 years old, building a sandcastle. It had blue shells by the entrance. A shiver ran down Michael's spine. The beach house in Cape Cod really did have a seashell mosaic with bluish tones that his mother had made. It was such a specific detail, so intimate to the family history, that it would be impossible for anyone to know by coincidence. "And this place?" he asked, showing another photo where he appeared with his parents in front of a church. Elizabeth touched the image reverently. "St. Mary's Church. You had your first communion there. You were so nervous, you spent the whole morning rehearsing the responses. Your father thought it was silly, but I kept practicing with you in the car, remember?" A solitary tear rolled down Michael's face. He didn't remember that specific detail, but it made perfect sense. His father had always scorned religious rituals, while his mother, though not very devout, respected traditions. "And in that church," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing softer, "we made a promise in case you—" She stopped, furrowing her brow as if something blocked the memory. "In case I got better?" Michael ventured, recalling the severe pneumonia he'd had at 8. "Yes," Elizabeth's face lit up. "Pneumonia. 3 days of high fever. The doctors were worried. I promised to light candles for St. Mary for a whole year if you recovered. And I did, every Sunday without fail." As she spoke, her posture shifted subtly. She sat up straighter. Her gestures became more precise. It was as if, by accessing these deep memories, something of her original essence briefly returned, cutting through decades of hospitalization and medication. Before leaving, he decided to speak with the nursing home administration. He was greeted by a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Thompson, the facility's director. "Mr. Coleman, how can I help you?" she asked, gesturing to a chair in her modest but tidy office. I'd like to know more about Mrs. Elizabeth Parker. How long exactly has she been here? Who brought her in? Are there any prior records? The director studied him with a cautious look. May I ask what your interest is in Mrs. Elizabeth? Michael hesitated. Sharing his suspicions might sound absurd, maybe even alarming. He decided to be partially honest. She reminds me a lot of someone I knew, someone very important to me, who I lost touch with many years ago. Dr. Sarah nodded as if understanding. Unfortunately, I can't share personal information about our residents without proper authorization. Privacy matters, you understand? Even if this person might have been reported missing, Michael pressed. The director seemed momentarily uncomfortable. Mr. Coleman, if you believe Mrs. Elizabeth might be a missing person, the proper procedure would be to file a formal report with the authorities. They can conduct the appropriate investigation. Michael realized he wouldn't get answers this way. He thanked her politely and stood to leave when the director added, Mrs. Elizabeth has had very few visitors in recent years. Your presence seems to have been positive for her. You're welcome to keep visiting if you'd like. When he returned home, Jennifer was waiting anxiously in the living room. Well, she asked, as soon as her husband walked in. Is it really her? Michael sank onto the couch, emotionally and physically exhausted. I don't know, Jennifer. Physically it could be. She has the same mannerisms, the same gestures, but her memory is damaged. I couldn't get confirmation. Jennifer sat beside her husband, holding his hand. Michael, you need to consider the possibility that you're seeing what you want to see. It's been 35 years. People change, especially in old age. You don't understand, he snapped, irritated. There are things you don't forget, the way she tilts her head when she smiles, how she folds napkins into perfect triangles, details no one could imitate. And if it is her, what do you plan to do? The question caught Michael off guard. What did he plan to do after all? He hadn't made any plans beyond confirming his suspicions. I don't know yet. First, I need to be sure. Then, Michael paused, thinking, then I need to understand what happened, why she disappeared, why she never tried to reach out. Jennifer hesitated before asking the next question. Have you talked to your father about this? Michael stiffened. His relationship with his father had always been complicated, made worse by his mother's abandonment. William Coleman, now 75, lived alone on a farm in Westchester, practically reclusive, seeing his son only on specific occasions. No, and I don't plan to mention anything until I'm sure. But the seed of doubt had already been planted. What if Jennifer was right? What if he was just projecting his wishes onto a woman who, by coincidence, resembled his mother? How could he be absolutely sure after so many years? The next morning, Michael received a call from Robert, his lawyer. I've got some preliminary information about Spring Haven, Robert said. It's a legitimate institution founded 20 years ago. It has good reviews, no major legal issues. As for the resident you mentioned, Elizabeth Parker, records show she was admitted in 2010, brought in by a woman named Margaret Parker, who identified herself as her sister. Margaret Parker. Michael's heart raced. Margaret was the name of his maternal aunt, his mother's sister. Do you have any contact information for this Margaret? An address in Naperville and a phone number that seems inactive. I'm digging deeper. Find her, Robert, it's important. In the following weeks, Michael completely rearranged his routine. He delegated responsibilities at the company, cancelled social engagements, and began visiting Elizabeth daily. Each time he brought different objects that might spark her memories. An old music box, a book his mother used to read to him, even the perfume she wore, found after a determined search in specialty stores. The staff at the nursing home watched, intrigued, as this polished businessman now seemed so devoted to a woman who, as far as they knew, had no family around. Some speculated about his intentions, others found it touching, but everyone noticed that somehow the visits were having a positive effect on Elizabeth. She's been more alert since he started coming, a nurse remarked one morning. She even asked what day it was yesterday, wondering if he'd visit. These small victories fueled Michael's hope. At home, however, the situation grew increasingly tense. Jennifer, initially understanding, began showing impatience with her husband's obsession. You missed the meeting with the Chinese investors, she complained after yet another cancelled commitment. Richard had to handle it alone. He called me worried, thinking you're sick and hiding it. The company won't collapse because I missed one meeting, Jennifer, Michael replied. Curtly, it's not just one meeting. It's weeks of strange behavior. You've practically moved into that nursing home. You barely talk to me when you're here. This isn't healthy, Michael. You should consider getting professional help. The argument escalated, harsh words exchanged. For the first time in their marriage, Michael spent the night in the guest room. The next morning, an unexpected call interrupted the couple's silent breakfast. Mr. Coleman. It was Dr. Sarah from the nursing home. I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I thought you'd want to know. Mrs. Elizabeth had a restless night. She woke up several times calling for someone, a name she'd never mentioned before. Michael's heart pounded. What name? Michael. She was calling for a Michael. The phone nearly slipped from his trembling hands. His name. She was calling for him, for her son. I'm on my way right now, he said before hanging up. Jennifer, who was watching the scene, didn't need to hear the explanation. Her husband's transformed face said it all. It's her, isn't it? She asked softly. She said my name, Jennifer. My name. On the way to the nursing home, driving well over the speed limit, Michael felt as if he were living in a dream, or perhaps waking from a 35-year-long nightmare. When he arrived at Spring Haven, he was greeted by a concerned nurse. She's been restless since last night. We had to give her a mild sedative so she could rest. Michael found Elizabeth sitting in her usual chair, but her gaze was different, more present, more intense. Elizabeth, he called, approaching cautiously. She turned and her eyes fixed on him with a clarity she hadn't shown before. You came, she said with a shaky smile. I knew you would. You called for me last night, Michael said, sitting beside her. You called for Michael. Elizabeth furrowed her brow as if trying to gather scattered thoughts. Michael, she repeated, testing the name. My little Mike. You've grown so much. The tears Michael had held back for weeks finally came, uncontrollable. It was her. It was his mother. Mom, he whispered, holding her wrinkled hands. Why did you leave? What happened? The light in Elizabeth's eyes flickered, like a flame fighting against the wind. Leave? I never left, my son. They took me. Before she could say more, her eyes lost focus, and she turned to look out the window as if the brief connection had been severed. Michael tried to bring her back, but it was as if a door had closed. The moment of clarity had passed. Dr. Sarah, who had been observing from a distance, approached with a compassionate expression. This happens sometimes with dementia patients. Moments of clarity come unexpectedly, like windows opening and closing. There's no way to predict when or how long they'll last. But she recognized me, Michael insisted. She knows who I am. I believe she does, the doctor agreed, and that's extraordinary given her overall condition. It suggests the deepest emotional memories remain intact, even when others fade. Michael's phone buzzed. A message from Robert. Found Margaret. Parker. Lives in a gated community in Naperville. Have the address. Calling in 5 with details. A wave of adrenaline hit Michael. Margaret Parker. His mother's sister, whom he hadn't seen since childhood. The woman who apparently had known the truth all along. After spending a few more hours with Elizabeth, who had no further moments of clarity, Michael set off for Naperville. He drove the 60 miles in a daze, trying to organize the questions pounding in his mind. How had his mother ended up in that nursing home? Why had the family believed she left them willingly? What had Margaret's role been in all of this? The community was modest, but well kept. Michael parked in front of the indicated building and took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell of apartment 302. After a moment, the door was opened by a tired-looking woman with graying hair tied in a loose ponytail. She looked at Michael with curiosity, which quickly turned to shock as recognition struck. My God, she whispered, covering her mouth. Michael. Hello, Aunt Margaret, he replied with a calm he didn't feel. Can we talk? Margaret looked as if she'd seen a ghost. Her face paled and she leaned against the doorframe. How did you find me? Does it matter? Michael answered. I found my mother at Spring Haven. I think you owe me some explanations." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the impact of those words. Then she opened the door completely. "Come in," she said simply. The apartment was small and full of plants. Framed photos covered a shelf in the living room. Michael noticed his mother didn't appear in any of them. "How much does she remember?" Margaret asked, pouring coffee with trembling hands. "Not much. She has dementia, but today she called me by name, said she never left, that they took her." "What does that mean, Aunt?" Margaret sank heavily into an armchair, suddenly looking much older. "I feared this day would come," she confessed. "But maybe it's for the best, carrying secrets for so many years. It destroys a person from the inside." Michael waited, fighting his impatience. Margaret seemed to be gathering courage. "Your mother didn't abandon you, Michael," she finally said. "She never would. She loved you more than anything." Michael felt a lump in his throat. "Then what happened?" Margaret took a sip of coffee, buying time. "You must remember your mother wasn't well back then, after your brother's birth." "Who died a week later," Michael finished, recalling the brother he'd barely known. "Yes." "Elizabeth fell into a deep depression. Today we'd call it severe postpartum depression, but back then, your father just thought she was being weak, that she needed to pull herself together." Margaret paused as if the memories were too painful. "Your father had her committed, Michael." "Committed? How?" A chill ran down Michael's spine. "To a psychiatric clinic in Rockford. He said it was temporary, just until she got better. But he was ashamed. Didn't want friends or business partners knowing his wife had mental problems. So he told you and everyone she'd left, that she'd abandoned the family." The revelation hit Michael like a punch. Childhood memories resurfaced, his father snapping when he asked about his mother, saying she didn't love them enough to stay, that it was best to forget her. "And you knew all along?" he asked, voice thick with anger and pain. Margaret looked down, ashamed. "At first, no. Your father kept it from everyone. I only found out years later by chance. I discovered clinic documents among his things in your grandparents' attic after they—" She hesitated, carefully choosing her words to avoid explicit mentions of death. "After the house was empty," she corrected. "I confronted your father, threatened to expose him. That's when he took me to the clinic." Margaret took a deep breath, eyes glistening. Elizabeth wasn't herself anymore, Michael. Years of heavy medication, outdated treatments. She barely recognized anyone. Your father used that to convince me, see, she can't come back. Not like this. What would Michael think seeing his mother this way? Better he keeps the memory he has of her. Michael stood, unable to contain his agitation. "And you agreed? Let my mother rot in a clinic while I grew up believing she didn't love me enough to stay? What kind of sister does that?" Margaret didn't defend herself. Silent tears rolled down her wrinkled face. "I have no excuses, Michael. At the time it seemed less cruel. Then the years passed and the lie grew so big I didn't know how to undo it. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now continuing. How did she end up at Spring Haven? The clinic in Rockford was closing about 15 years ago. It no longer met standards. Your father refused to get involved again, said I had to handle it. That's when I transferred her to Spring Haven. I used my maiden name to register her, to avoid any connections with the Coleman family. I visited as often as I could at first. Then, I admit, the visits became more spaced out." Michael sat down again, trying to process the avalanche of information. "Why didn't you come to me after my father, after he stepped away? Why keep up the lie?" Margaret looked out the window, desolate. "Fear, perhaps. Shame. How do you explain to a grown, successful man that his entire life was built on a lie? That his mother never abandoned him but was kept away for decades? That his aunt was complicit in that cruelty?" She turned her gaze back to her nephew. "I didn't expect forgiveness, Michael. I still don't." A heavy silence fell between them. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room. "I need to talk to my father," Michael finally said, standing up. "He's sick, Michael," Margaret warned. "His heart." "I don't care about the state of his heart," Michael cut in coldly. "Not after what he did to my mother's heart or mine." When he left Margaret's apartment, Michael didn't go home. He couldn't face Jennifer in that state. Instead, he drove to a nearby hotel and booked a room. He needed solitude to absorb everything he'd learned, to process the anger and pain threatening to consume him. The truth was crueler than any scenario he'd imagined. There had been no abandonment, only a forced separation. His mother hadn't chosen to leave. She'd been torn from his life by his own father's decision. Lying on the impersonal hotel bed, Michael cried as he hadn't since childhood. He wept for the mother he'd lost, for the wasted years, for the lie that had shaped his existence. The next morning, after a nearly sleepless night, he called Jennifer. "Where are you? I've been worried." His wife's voice carried genuine concern. "I needed time to think," he replied. "I found out some difficult things about your mother." "Yes, and about my father." Michael briefly recounted what he'd discovered. Jennifer listened in silence, occasionally murmuring in surprise or indignation. "My God, Michael, and that's awful. What are you going to do now?" "I'm going to the nursing home first. Then I'll confront my father." "Do you want me to come with you?" Michael hesitated. Part of him wanted to face it alone, but another part knew he needed support. "Yes," he finally answered, "but not to see my father, to meet my mother." That afternoon, Michael and Jennifer went together to Spring Haven. He introduced his wife to Elizabeth, who was having a good day according to the nurses. More alert, though not as strikingly clear as the day before. "This is Jennifer, Mum," Michael said, carefully watching the elderly woman's reaction. "My wife." Elizabeth studied Jennifer's face with unusual focus. "Pretty," she remarked with a gentle smile. "She has kind eyes. Kindness is important." Jennifer, initially tense, relaxed at the warm reception. Soon she was showing photos of their 2 children on her phone, the grandchildren Elizabeth had never met. "This is Jason. He's 20. He's in engineering school like his dad," Jennifer explained as Elizabeth looked on with interest. "And this is Emily, 17, wants to study medicine." Michael watched the interaction with a tight heart, imagining how life might have been if his mother had been there all those years. If she'd known her grandchildren from birth, watched them grow, celebrated birthdays and graduations. While Jennifer continued talking with Elizabeth, Michael sought out Dr. Sarah for a private conversation. "I found the person who brought Mrs. Elizabeth here," he said as soon as they were alone in the director's office. "It was my aunt, and Elizabeth really is my mother, as I suspected." The doctor's expression showed surprise, but also a hint of validation, as if part of her already knew. "She was in a psychiatric institution for 20 years before coming here," continued Michael, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I want to understand her current condition. What can we expect? Are there treatments that might help her?" Dr. Sarah sighed, interlacing her fingers on the table. "Mr. Coleman, your mother's case is complex. Without access to her previous medical records, I can only assess what we observe here. She does show signs of dementia, yes, but there are peculiarities that have always intrigued me. Certain patterns of confusion that seem more related to prolonged trauma than typical neurological degeneration." "What does that mean in practical terms?" "It means part of her confusion may not be irreversible. With proper therapies, family support, perhaps we can recover more of her awareness and memory than would be possible in a typical dementia case." Michael felt a surge of hope. "I'll do whatever it takes. Cost isn't an issue." Dr. Sarah smiled faintly. "I believe your presence is already making a difference. Notice how she's more responsive, more connected. The human brain is extraordinary in its ability to create new pathways when motivated by meaningful emotional bonds." When he returned to Jennifer and Elizabeth, Michael found his mother holding a small cameo his wife wore. "It was my grandmother's," Jennifer explained, "passed to my mother, then to me. One day, it'll be Emily's." Elizabeth touched the delicate object with reverence. "I had one like this," she said, a glimmer of recognition in her eyes, "with a photo of my little Mike." Michael and Jennifer exchanged surprised glances. "Do you remember where that cameo is, Mom?" he asked gently. Elizabeth furrowed her brow, concentrating. "In the little blue box with my things," "What little blue box, Mom? Where is it?" But the moment had passed. Elizabeth handed the cameo back to Jennifer and turned to gaze out the window, suddenly distant again. As they left the facility, Jennifer held her husband's hand firmly. "She really is your mother," she said, no doubt in her voice. "And she's trying to come back to you, Michael. Somehow she's fighting her way through that fog." Michael nodded, too emotional to speak. The next step would be confronting his father, but he didn't want to do it with the anger still simmering inside him. He needed time to gather his thoughts, to decide how to approach the man who had ruined his mother's life and built his own on lies. In the days that followed, Michael and Jennifer became constant presences at Springhaven. They brought their children to meet their grandmother, briefly explaining the circumstances. Jason, pragmatic like his father, was reserved at first, not from lack of interest or compassion, but from the natural difficulty a 20-year-old feels connecting with a grandmother he'd never known, whose place in his life had been a void, a hazy story of abandonment now revealed as an elaborate lie. "I don't know how to act around her," he confessed to Michael after the first visit. "It's weird, she's my grandmother, but she's also a stranger." "It's not easy for her either," Michael replied, appreciating his son's honesty. "Try to find something in common, something that can bridge the gap." The bridge came unexpectedly on the third visit. Jason, following his father's suggestion, brought a newspaper while waiting for Michael to finish a phone call. Absently, he started doing the crossword on one of the pages. 7 letters, moral or social impediment, he murmured, more to himself than to Elizabeth, who was watching out the window. "Stigma," she answered without turning. Jason looked at his grandmother, surprised. "That's right. How did you know?" Elizabeth turned to him with a small smile. "Your grandfather loved crossword puzzles. We used to do them together every Sunday." She paused, as if gathering scattered memories. "You look just like him when you furrow your brow like that, so focused." That small moment broke the initial ice. On his next visit, Jason deliberately brought a crossword notebook and soon found himself sitting beside Elizabeth, sharing the pastime he had unknowingly inherited from his grandfather, whether through genes or unconsciously observing his father. Gradually, the crosswords evolved into shared reading sessions. Jason discovered that his grandmother enjoyed being read to. Her fading eyesight, combined with lapses in concentration, made independent reading difficult. He started by bringing the newspaper, reading articles aloud, and discussing them together. Then he experimented with books. First, light novels, then, noticing Elizabeth's genuine interest, more complex works he was studying in college. "She picks up on nuances I sometimes miss," he once remarked to Emily, genuinely impressed. "Yesterday we discussed Ernest Hemingway for almost 2 hours." Emily, on the other hand, had an instant connection with Elizabeth. There was something in the 17-year-old's sensitivity, her emotional intuition, that resonated deeply with her grandmother. As she brushed Elizabeth's white hair or painted her nails, Emily created a safe space where the older woman gradually shared fragments of memories, some painful, some joyful, all crucial pieces of the family puzzle that had remained incomplete for so long. "Grandma told me about the first time you went to the beach together," Emily said to Michael one afternoon. "She said you were so scared of the ocean that you clung to her legs for hours, but by the end of the day, you didn't want to leave the water." These small, seemingly trivial stories were precious to Michael, memories of his early childhood he couldn't recall himself, yet they had remained intact in his mother's mind, preserved like rare jewels amid the confusion that now often clouded her thoughts. Jason and Emily's presence had a transformative effect on Elizabeth. When they were around, she seemed more anchored in the present, less likely to drift into the tangled labyrinths of her damaged memory. The doctors noticed the improvement, attributing it to regular positive emotional stimulation. "The brain responds to affection in ways science is only beginning to understand," Dr. Sarah explained during a follow-up visit. "What we're seeing with Mrs. Elizabeth is remarkable. It's not a reversal of her condition, of course, but a significant optimization of her remaining cognitive potential." Michael requested the transfer of medical records from the clinic in Rockford, a slow, bureaucratic process. Meanwhile, he hired memory and cognition specialists to evaluate Elizabeth and recommend treatments. Aunt Margaret called daily, eager for updates, Offering help, Michael wasn't yet ready to accept. The wound of betrayal was still too fresh, the trust completely shattered. Finally, 2 weeks after the discovery, Michael gathered the courage to visit his father. He drove to Westchester on a rainy afternoon, the weather perfectly matching his mood. William Coleman's country house was large but poorly maintained. The once impeccable garden showed signs of neglect. The house, once grand, now seemed weary. Like its owner, Michael thought. His father answered the door after the third knock, wearing a faded robe over pajamas. At 75, William still carried the imposing posture that had intimidated Michael throughout his childhood, but his eyes had lost their authoritative gleam, replaced by a melancholy dullness. "Michael!" The surprise was genuine. His son rarely visited unannounced. "We need to talk, Dad." Something in Michael's tone must have alerted William, because he didn't question it, just stepped aside to let his son in. The living room was messy, with newspapers piled up and dirty dishes on the coffee table. There was no sign of the housekeeper Michael paid to clean 3 times a week. "I let Mrs. Jenkins go," William explained, noticing his son's glance. "I don't need anyone watching over me." Michael said nothing. There were more important matters to discuss. "I found my mother," he said without preamble. William froze, his hand hovering over the pack of cigarettes on the table. For several seconds, he didn't move or speak. Then slowly, he sank into the worn armchair. "Where?" he asked hoarsely. "In a nursing home. Spring Haven. Brought there by Aunt Margaret after spending 20 years in a psychiatric clinic in Rockford, where you committed her and left her." William closed his eyes as if the words had physically struck him. Margaret shouldn't have told me the truth," Michael interrupted, unable to contain his anger. "Well, it's too late now. I know everything. I know my mother never abandoned us. That the story you told for 35 years was a complete lie." William seemed to have aged 10 years in those few minutes. His shoulders slumped, and he stared at his own wrinkled, trembling hands. "You don't understand," he murmured. "Then make me understand." Michael exploded. "Explain how you could do this to her, how you could lie to me my entire life." William struggled to his feet and walked to a carved cabinet in the corner of the room. From a locked drawer, he pulled out a yellowed folder. "Read," he said, handing it to his son. "Then we'll talk." Michael opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were medical reports, letters, and various documents. He began reading, and each page twisted like a knife in his heart. The reports described Elizabeth's condition after childbirth: delusions, attempts to harm herself, an inability to care for her newborn. Then the tragedy of the baby, who didn't survive the first week, and Elizabeth's complete collapse. There were letters from psychiatrists recommending hospitalization, letters from William to the clinic, frequent at first, inquiring about his wife's condition, then growing sparse over the years, and there were letters from Elizabeth, letters never sent, intercepted by the clinic for being disturbing or incoherent. Letters addressed to Michael, filled with love, pleas for forgiveness, promises to return. Michael looked up at his father, who stood by the window, lost in memories. "Why did you keep all this?" he asked, his voice thick. William turned slowly. "So that one day when you were older you'd understand. But I never found the right moment. And the longer I waited, the harder it became. You say you committed her for her own good, but then you abandoned her there," Michael accused. William shook his head. "It wasn't like that. At first, I truly believed it would be temporary. The doctors said with proper treatment she'd come home in a few months, but months turned to years. Every visit was harder than the last. She didn't improve. Sometimes she didn't even recognize me. So you decided to erase her from our lives? I thought it would be easier." William's voice broke. "For you, especially. What was I supposed to tell a little boy? That his mother was locked in an asylum with no release date? It seemed simpler to say she was gone." Michael closed the folder, disgusted. "And when I wasn't a child anymore, when I became an adult, why didn't you tell me then?" William had no answer. Both knew the truth. The lie had become comfortable. Facing the truth would mean facing the guilt, the abandonment, the wrong choices. "I want you to meet her," said Michael, standing up. "She's lucid enough to understand who you are." William paled. I can't. You can and you will. You owe her that. You owe me. William seemed genuinely terrified by the idea. What if she hates me? After everything I've done? Maybe she should, Michael replied sharply. But surprisingly, there doesn't seem to be any hatred in her, just sadness and a lot of confusion. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. The following week, after days of Michael's insistence, William finally agreed to visit Elizabeth. The preparations for the meeting were meticulous. Michael spoke at length with Dr. Sarah and the other specialists, concerned about the emotional impact the reunion might have on his mother. We'll have the medical team on standby, Dr. Sarah assured him. But honestly, I believe this meeting could be therapeutic, especially considering her recent progress. And the progress was remarkable. With the family's constant presence, Elizabeth seemed more anchored in reality. Her episodes of confusion had lessened, and she had begun making more consistent connections between people and events. There were still lapses, moments when she drifted into the fog of her mind, but they were growing shorter. Moreover, the mention of the little blue box had led to a significant discovery. After Michael pressed her, Margaret confessed that she had kept some of Elizabeth's personal belongings in her apartment, items she had rescued from the clinic in Rockford when she transferred Elizabeth to Spring Haven. Among them was indeed a small blue porcelain box containing modest jewelry, unsent letters, and yes, a cameo with a photo of Michael as a child. These small confirmations of memory gave everyone hope. Perhaps with time and support, more fragments could be recovered, more connections re-established. On the morning of the meeting, Michael picked up his father personally. William was nervous, wearing an old suit that now seemed too big for his shrunken frame. He held a bouquet of daisies, Elizabeth's favorite flowers, Michael remembered. Surprised his father still recalled that detail. The drive to the care home was tense and silent. Occasionally, Michael glanced at his father, noticing how his hands trembled, how his gaze seemed lost beyond the windshield. She's different, Michael warned, finally breaking the silence. More fragile physically, and there are moments when she doesn't seem fully present. Don't expect a normal conversation. William nodded, unable to trust his voice to respond. At Spring Haven, they were greeted by Dr. Sarah, who studied William with a measured look. Then she led them to the inner garden, where Elizabeth sat beneath a tree, an open book in her lap. Jennifer was with her, reading aloud, but she stopped when she saw Michael and his father approaching. "I'll leave you alone," she said, rising after casting a worried glance at her husband. Elizabeth looked up, curious about the movement. Her gaze passed over Michael with recognition and affection, then settled on William. For several seconds there was no visible reaction. Then, slowly, her eyes widened and her hands began to tremble. "William!" Her voice was barely a whisper. The old man nodded, unable to speak. Michael had never seen his father so vulnerable, so utterly defenseless. "Have you come to take me home?" Elizabeth asked with surprising clarity. "After all this time?" The question struck William like a physical blow. He swayed slightly and Michael had to steady him. Then, with unsteady steps, William approached and sat beside Elizabeth. "I've come to ask for forgiveness," he said at last, his voice breaking with emotion. "I know I don't deserve it, but I came to ask for forgiveness." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment, then at Michael as if trying to connect the dots of a complex puzzle. "Our son has grown up," she remarked with a faint smile. "He looks like you. He has your eyes." William couldn't hold back his tears. He reached out a trembling hand to touch Elizabeth's, unsure if the gesture would be welcome. To everyone's surprise, she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at the flowers he had brought. "Daisies," she said with a flicker of recognition. "You used to give me daisies when we were dating." William nodded, surprised and moved that she remembered. "They were your favorite." "You gave me daisies the day Michael was born," she continued, her gaze distant. "And also the day—" She stopped, frowning as if she had hit a block in her memory. Michael knew what was coming. The day their second child had been born, only to pass away a week later, the trauma that had set everything in motion. "Don't force yourself, Mom," he said gently. "The memories will come back when they're ready." William looked at Elizabeth as if seeing a ghost, and in a way he was. The woman before him was no longer the young wife he had known, nor the troubled patient he had committed. She was a survivor, marked by time and suffering, but still here, still fighting to reconnect with the world that had been denied to her for so long. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Elizabeth tired quickly, her attention shifting between the present and the past, reality and fragments of memory. But in those brief moments of connection, something fundamental had changed. A door that had been closed for decades had begun to open. As they left, William seemed physically and emotionally drained. "You were right to bring me here," he said to Michael once they were in the car. "I needed to see her. She deserved to see me." Michael nodded, still processing his own emotions. "This doesn't erase what you did," he said after a pause. "Nor does it make me understand or accept your choices. I know. But it's a start," Michael concluded, "for all of us." In the weeks that followed, a routine was established. Michael visited his mother daily. Jennifer and the kids came 3 times a week. Margaret approached cautiously, trying to rebuild bridges, allowed to visit only under Michael or Jennifer's supervision. William came once a week, always on Sundays. The visits were brief and emotionally exhausting, but gradually they became less tense. There was no explicit forgiveness, perhaps there never would be, but there was a genuine effort to reconnect. The tension between Michael and his Aunt Margaret persisted, showing itself in clipped conversations, wary glances, and a coldness. That contrasted with the closeness they had shared during his childhood, when Margaret would occasionally visit them. One rainy afternoon, while Elizabeth rested, the two found themselves in the nursing home's waiting room. "Why, Aunt?" Michael finally asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Why did you keep this lie going for so long?" Margaret looked out the window, watching the raindrops slide down the glass, as if searching for an answer in their patterns. "At first it was fear of your father," she answered after a long silence. "William was always an intimidating man. You know that. He threatened to sue me if I tried to interfere, said I'd be labeled mentally unstable, like Elizabeth. And later, when he stepped away, when I grew up," Margaret sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Later, it was shame, cowardice. Every year that passed made the lie bigger, more impossible to undo. How could I explain to a teenager, then to a young man, that his whole life was built on a lie?" Michael studied his aunt, noticing for the first time how fragile and aged she seemed. His hair, once a vibrant brown like his mother's, had turned completely grey. Deep wrinkles marked his face, especially around his eyes that, he realized, carried decades of guilt. "I visited Elizabeth religiously in the early years," continued Margaret, her voice barely a whisper, "until it became too painful. Seeing her waste away in that place, losing herself more and more in the fog of medication and neglect, I started spacing out the visits. I delegated checking on her well-being to social workers I paid to send reports." The admission of this gradual distance, so similar to William's, made Michael question how easily he had judged his father without considering the complexity of the situation. During her last 5 years at the clinic in Rockford, she had a different doctor, Margaret added. Dr. Parker, a younger man with more progressive ideas. He was the one who began reducing her medication, implementing alternative therapies. Elizabeth showed significant improvement. She even asked about you. Michael felt a lump in his throat. "And you didn't think that justified telling me the truth?" "I thought about it. I even drove to your office once," Margaret confessed. "I sat in the parking lot for hours, rehearsing what I'd say. But then I read an article about you in Fortune magazine, the exemplary businessman, the perfect family man. How could I suddenly show up and shatter that image, revealing that your mother hadn't abandoned you but had been institutionalized for decades, that your father was a liar, that your aunt was complicit in that lie?" Michael had no answer for that. Part of him wanted to keep hating Margaret for her silence, for her role in the lie that shaped his life. Another part was beginning to understand that there were no simplistic villains in this story, just flawed people facing situations they weren't prepared for, making choices that, in hindsight, were deeply mistaken. When the clinic in Rockford announced its closure, I decided to transfer her to Spring Haven, Margaret continued. I prepaid for 5 years of care. I used my maiden name to register her, to avoid any connection to the Coleman family. Her condition had stabilized, but decades of heavy medication left permanent marks on her cognition, her memory. Why Spring Haven? Why not another medical facility? Because it wasn't a medical issue anymore, not really, Margaret explained. Dr. Parker was clear. She no longer needed restraint or intensive psychiatric treatment. She needed dignity, quality of life. Spring Haven offered that, with proper medical care but in a more humane environment. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse announcing that Elizabeth had woken up and was asking for Michael. Before parting, Margaret gently touched her nephew's arm. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Michael. I know what I did or didn't do was unforgivable. I just want you to know there wasn't a single day I didn't think about you and your mother, about how things could have been different. The specialists Michael hired worked with Elizabeth daily, using various therapies to stimulate her memory and cognition. The results were promising, though the doctors warned there would be limits to her recovery. The damage was extensive and prolonged, one neurologist explained. Decades of improper medication, lack of cognitive stimulation, untreated emotional trauma. It's remarkable how much she's regained, given the circumstances. Michael refused to lose hope. Every small progress was celebrated. A new memory, fragment recovered, a connection made between past and present events, moments of clarity that lasted longer and longer. One afternoon, during a visit from Jason and Emily, there was a significant breakthrough. Jason was showing his grandmother an app on his tablet, explaining how it worked. Emily, sitting on the floor at her grandmother's feet, was arranging flowers in a vase. You've always loved technology, Elizabeth suddenly remarked, looking at her grandson. Ever since you were little. Jason glanced at his grandmother, confused. Grandma, you're mixing me up with Dad. I was never little when you met me. Elizabeth smiled with an unusual clarity in her eyes. Not you, Jason. Your father. Michael loved taking things apart to see how they worked inside. Watches, radios, anything with small pieces. Jason looked surprised at Emily, who immediately pulled out her phone and called her father. When Michael arrived, breathless from running down the hallway of the nursing home, he found his mother in one of her most lucid moments in years. For nearly 2 hours, she talked about memories from his childhood, his first day of school, his 7th birthday party, the dog they briefly had, the time he fell from the tree in the backyard and broke his arm. These were memories Michael had, thought were lost forever, not just to her but to himself. Hearing his mother reconstruct them, with vivid details and genuine emotion, was like unearthing a long-buried treasure. That night, after everyone had left, Elizabeth asked to speak privately with Dr. Sarah. I want to go home, she said, gripping the doctor's hand firmly. I know I'm not cured, I know I never will be completely, but I want to spend the time I have left with my family, the time they stole from me. Dr. Sarah, though surprised by the request, promised to discuss it with Michael and the medical team. It wouldn't be a simple decision. Elizabeth still needed specialized care, constant supervision, controlled medication. When Michael learned of her request the next day, he felt a mix of emotions: joy at his mother's desire to be closer, anxiety about how it would work logistically, fear of not being able to provide the necessary care. He talked at length with Jennifer, who was initially apprehensive but soon warmed to the idea. We have the space, we have the resources, she argued. We can hire nurses, adapt a suite on the ground floor. Your parents stole decades with her. Don't let insecurity steal anymore. The decision was made after several meetings with the medical team and long family discussions. The house underwent modifications. A specialized nurse was hired full-time, and another for the night shift. A spacious room on the ground floor was completely renovated for Elizabeth, with furniture designed to facilitate her mobility and safety. Moving day was filled with anticipation and nervousness. Elizabeth, dressed in a light blue outfit specially chosen by Emily, seemed both anxious and apprehensive. As she entered the Coleman's home, she looked around as if stepping into a world that was both strange and familiar. "This is your home now, Grandma," Emily said, holding her hand. "Our home is yours." The first few days were an adjustment. Elizabeth, used to the rigid routine of the nursing home, sometimes got confused by the different schedules and spaces. There were difficult moments of confusion and anxiety, but there were also unexpected joys. The pleasure of having breakfast with the family, watching a movie with her grandchildren, simply being in an environment that breathed life and love, not isolation and abandonment. William, after much reluctance, was invited for a Sunday lunch. He entered his son's house with visible discomfort, carrying another bouquet of daisies and an old wooden box. "I found this in the attic," he explained, handing the box to Elizabeth. "I thought you might like to have it back." Inside the box were old photographs, letters, small mementos of a past that seemed to belong to other people. Elizabeth spent the entire afternoon exploring that treasure, occasionally calling Michael or William over to show them something or share a memory. At one particularly touching moment, she found a child's drawing made by Michael, depicting the family, father, mother, and son holding hands, with a smiling son in the top corner. "You gave me this for Mother's Day just before..." Her voice faltered. "Just before I left. You said we were the happiest family in the world." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. No one corrected Elizabeth about the nature of her departure. The softened version, left instead of was committed against her will, seemed gentler on her fragile heart. Michael watching. His mother and father together, separated by decades of wrong choices and pain, but still connected by shared memories, thought about how life could be both cruel and generous at once. Cruel for tearing apart people who loved each other, generous for offering, even belatedly, chances to reconnect. Elizabeth's presence transformed the Coleman home. Jason and Emily, initially unsure how to relate to this newly discovered grandmother, soon developed special routines with her. Jason read to Elizabeth every night. Emily learned to prepare the specific teas her grandmother enjoyed. Jennifer, ever practical, coordinated medical care, specialist visits, and medication management. Her loving efficiency created a safe environment where Elizabeth could focus on living, not just surviving. Michael, torn between work and family, made significant adjustments to his professional routine. He delegated more responsibilities, reduced travel, and implemented remote work when possible. His relationship with his father remained complicated, marked by old resentments, but it gradually evolved into something, if not fully reconciled, at least peaceful. Margaret visited regularly, always bringing homemade sweets, a childhood tradition she had shared with her sister. Her relationship with Michael was still tense, but he acknowledged, albeit reluctantly, how genuinely committed his aunt was to helping now. One afternoon, while having tea in the garden, Margaret brought up an important matter. "Elizabeth has a small inheritance," she revealed. "Our parents left savings for her that were never touched. Besides that, ever since I brought her to Spring Haven, I've been putting money into an account every month. It wasn't much, but it added up over time. I thought she might need it someday." Michael looked at his aunt in surprise. "Why? Did you really believe she'd come back to the family one day?" Margaret lowered her eyes. "At first, no. It was more guilt, I suppose. But over time, especially in recent years, I started thinking that maybe, when he was no longer interfering, it might be possible to reconnect the two of you. That money, though Michael insisted it wasn't necessary, ended up being used to establish a foundation, the Elizabeth Parker Foundation, dedicated to supporting long-term psychiatric patients and facilitating their family reintegration. It was a way to transform Elizabeth's personal tragedy into something that could help others in similar situations. The foundation's inauguration, 6 months after, Elizabeth moved into her son's home, was a moment of celebration and reflection. In the short speech he prepared, Michael didn't hide their family history. He spoke openly about the stigma of mental illness, how that stigma had destroyed his family, and how important it was to fight it. Elizabeth, seated in the front row, between Jennifer and William, listened with tears in her eyes. When it was her turn to cut the ribbon, she stood with Michael's help, and, to everyone's surprise, wanted to say a few words. "For many years I lived in the shadows," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Not just the shadows of my confused mind, but the shadows of forgetfulness, of abandonment. Today, I feel in the light again. Not because I'm cured, I never will be completely, but because I'm loved. Because I'm allowed to be who I am with all my cracks and patches." Elizabeth looked directly at William before continuing, "I'm not here to accuse anyone. The past is past. I'm here to give thanks for the present, for every day I have, with my son, my daughter-in-law, my grandchildren, for every memory I recover, for every new memory we create together." There wasn't a dry eye in the audience when she finished. William, in particular, seemed devastated by emotion. When Elizabeth returned to her seat, he briefly held her hand, a gesture that said more than any words could. The seasons passed, and with them came subtle but meaningful changes. Elizabeth had good days and bad days, as expected. There were mornings when she woke up confused, calling for people long gone, afternoons when she got lost inside her own home, nights disturbed by nightmares of the past. But there were also moments of pure joy. Emily's 18th birthday, celebrated with a special dinner where Elizabeth helped bake the cake. Christmas, with the whole family gathered, including William and Margaret, in an unspoken truce for everyone's sake. Jason's graduation, where Elizabeth, though physically frail, insisted on being present. The relationship between Elizabeth and William evolved in unexpected ways. There was never a return to the romantic love they once shared. Too much. Water had passed under that bridge, but a quiet companionship developed instead. He visited her regularly, bringing books she liked, patiently listening to the same stories repeated, accepting with resignation the occasional moments of reproach when she was more lucid and remembered the abandonment. During one of these visits, William suffered a mild heart attack. It was Elizabeth who noticed the first signs, alerting the family and possibly saving his life. While he recovered, she insisted on visiting him in the hospital, temporarily reversing their roles. Now she was the one bringing flowers, holding his hand, offering comfort. "Ironic, isn't it?" he commented when they were alone. "After everything, here you are taking care of me." "Life is full of twists and turns, William," she replied with an enigmatic smile. "Some take decades to unfold." Elizabeth's health, though relatively stable thanks to constant care, gradually declined. Old age, combined with years of inadequate treatment at the institution, took its toll. On bad days, it became harder to bring her back to clarity. One day, as Michael walked with his mother during her daily garden stroll, she suddenly stopped, looking at the sky with a serene expression. "You know what saddens me the most?" she asked. "What, Mom?" "All the lost time. All the birthdays of yours I missed. All the times you needed me and I wasn't there." Michael felt a lump in his throat. "It wasn't your fault, Mom, never was." Elizabeth looked at her son with unusual clarity in her eyes. "I know that now. But for so many years, in the darkest hours at the clinic, I blamed myself. I thought I'd failed as a mother, that was why they took me away from you. It wasn't until you found me, until I saw the wonderful man you'd become, that I understood. You turned out fine. You found your way even without me." Michael hugged his mother, trying to convey through that gesture all the pent-up love of decades. "I found my way," he agreed, "but I never stopped missing you. I never stopped looking for you, even when I didn't know I was searching." On an autumn afternoon, nearly 2 years after Elizabeth had moved into her son's home, the family gathered for a special lunch. It was Elizabeth's 80th birthday, a date that for decades had passed without celebration, forgotten in the cold hallways of the institution where she had been confined. Emily had decorated the dining room with fresh flowers, daisies, her grandmother's favorite, and subtle balloons. Jason had brought a chocolate walnut cake, the old recipe Elizabeth had once described during a rare moment of clarity as the one she used to make for Michael's childhood birthdays. Jennifer had taken care of every detail of the lunch, preparing her mother-in-law's favorite dishes, discovered over months of living together. Even William and Margaret were present, seated on opposite ends of the table, a silent reminder of the complex family dynamics still in the process of healing. During the meal, Elizabeth was exceptionally present, joining in conversations, laughing at the stories Jason told about college, listening intently as Emily described her plans for medical school. It was as if, on that special day, the fog that usually clouded her mind had temporarily lifted, allowing her true personality to shine through without hindrance. It was during dessert that something extraordinary happened. Elizabeth, after silently observing the family interaction for a few moments, straightened in her chair and looked around the table, her blue eyes scanning each face with striking clarity. Then she smiled, a smile that seemed to hold all the wisdom and peace only someone who had survived unimaginable hardships could possess. "You know," she said, her voice steady and melodious, without the tremor that often marked it, "I always wondered what it would be like to be with all of you. Like this, in my darkest moments, this image kept me alive, my son happy, surrounded by love with his own family. And here we are." William at the far end of the table lowered his gaze, emotion making it impossible to maintain eye contact. Margaret discreetly wiped away a tear. Jennifer squeezed Michael's hand under the table, offering silent support. "When I was in that place," Elizabeth continued, referring to the clinic without naming it directly, "there was a small window in my room. On clear days I could see the sky, a few trees. I imagined that you, Michael, were somewhere under that same sky, living your life. I wondered what your grown face would look like if you had married, if you had children." Elizabeth paused, looking fondly at Jason and Emily. Such beautiful, smart grandchildren, exactly as I imagined they'd be. Then her gaze shifted to Jennifer, and a daughter-in-law who cares for everyone with so much love, who welcomed a broken old woman she barely knew into her home just because she mattered to her husband. Jennifer, normally so composed, couldn't hold back her tears. Elizabeth then fixed her eyes on Margaret. "My sister," she said, with a complexity of emotion in her voice that would be impossible to fully decipher, "who made mistakes like all of us, but who never completely forgot me." Margaret openly sobbed, unable to respond. Finally, Elizabeth's gaze settled on William. For a long moment she simply looked at him, decades of shared history hanging between them like a tangible ghost. "William," she said at last, "father of my son, companion of my youth. Life hasn't been kind to you either, has it? Carrying all these years the weight of a decision you didn't know how to undo." William raised his eyes, red and watery, meeting Elizabeth's gaze for the first time during the meal. "Elizabeth, She gently raised her hand, stopping him. "No words are needed today. Time speaks for itself." Then turning to Michael, who could barely contain his emotion, Elizabeth added in a voice that held all the maternal love she had been forced to suppress for decades, "You found me. After all this time, you found me." Michael, unable to speak, simply took his mother's hand between his own, holding it as if it were something infinitely precious and fragile. "And I'll never let you go again," he promised, when he finally regained his voice. Elizabeth's smile in that moment transcended her frail physical condition, the wrinkles marking her face, the white hair that had once been reddish-brown like Michael's. It was a full, radiant smile, untouched by shadows of the past, a smile that would forever be etched in the memory of everyone present. That moment crystallized a profound truth everyone there understood without words. Despite the lost decades, the traumas endured, the pains carried, there was something time and suffering couldn't erase. The love between a mother and her son, a love capable of crossing through forgetfulness, separation, and finally finding its way back. The end. Did you manage to hold back your tears? Did this story of reunion and family healing touch your heart? Share your feelings and experiences with us in the comments. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories about bonds even time can't break.